Hey there YouTube, welcome to another episode of Bert's Bike. Today we're going to be going over my CB300R. I'd like to take you through my thoughts, opinions, my likes and dislikes on this particular motorcycle, as well as who I think this bike is really for. So hang tight, let's roll that intro and get into it.
Is it walk time? Yeah. All right.
Welcome again to the channel, guys. First off, I'd like to start off with saying thank you so much to all the viewers and subscribers. The Indian Scout video is upwards of 20,000 plus views. I couldn't have done it without you, so thank you very, very much. So let's just get this out of the way. This is a 300cc motorcycle. It's a small bike, but in my opinion, it's more than meets the eye. It offers a lot more than the spec sheet, and it might be more capable than you would think. Before I started riding, a friend of mine told me that these small displacement bikes are a lot of fun and that you can really use all of the power. And being a new rider at the time, I didn't know exactly what he meant, but I had some idea of what he meant. So after going through bigger displacement bikes, small displacement bikes, some stuff in the middle, I really do enjoy a good 300cc motorcycle or 250. There's just something about these little engines, these little thumpers, that I really love and enjoy. So let's start with the overall look of the bike. This is Honda's neo-retro styling, and in my opinion, I really like the look of it. I think it's modern, yet retro, without being overly styled or aggressive in any way. It's not too sport bike kid, and it's not too old school bike. It's something in the middle. I also noticed from looking at this bike in certain angles or at a distance, the bike seems a little more stout or bigger than it really is. It's not until you walk up to it and are standing right next to it that you realize how compact of a package it really is. So in my opinion, it's a stylish and kind of muscly looking utilitarian retro bike. So moving on to fit and finish, let's talk about this a little bit. It's classic Honda. Nothing's really jumping out, nothing's really out of alignment. There's just a couple of things that I thought they may have skimped out a little bit on that could have made this bike even better. One, the screen glass seems to scratch very easily. In fact, on the first day, I put a scuff mark in it that will not come out. The second thing is the weld spots. They seem a little sloppy. I'm sure they're fine and welded correctly, but they just seem just a little sloppy to me. The second thing is that the tank is actually a metal tank, but it has a shroud over it. So the blue that you see on the tank, it's actually plastic over the metal tank, which is kind of cool because if you put a dent in that part, you can just replace that panel and not really have to worry too much about it. Let's touch on this LCD screen because a lot of new riders like to have a lot of information up there. So it is a negative look, which means the numbers and tachometer and letters are all in white, and the background is, I think, a black or dark blue. It looks kind of blue to me when I see it. So you have your tacho, your fuel gauge, your trip meters. You have a stopwatch on there, which I've never used for anything, but it's nice to have, I guess. It's got a clock on there. You can dim and brighten the screen. There is, however, no gear indicator on this 2020 model. It's not a big deal for me personally, but I know a lot of other riders like to have that. Let's talk about what it's like to sit on the bike. So I'm 6'1", and the bike is a little deceptively taller than you might think. The foot peg placement is comfortable. However, when you come to a stop and put your feet down, you notice you have to put your feet a little wider than on most bikes. And it takes a little bit to get used to, but after a while you don't think about it anymore. The seat isn't particularly plush, but it's adequate. It's pretty thin, but not uncomfortable. If you're doing some long distances here and there, it's probably fine, but if you're planning on doing some serious miles on this, you might want to look into a different seat. The layout of the screen and controls is all where it needs to be, but if you've ever ridden a Honda, you know that the turn signals and the horn are reversed, so that's just something to look out for. When I swap between this bike and another bike, I always end up beeping at people for the first couple of turns. The suspension on this bike is actually pretty good. Now, the front forks are actually Shoei forks. They're non-adjustable, but they seem more than adequate. The rear, however, has a lot of sag, and it definitely feels pretty spongy. So, if you are a lighter weight rider, it's probably fine for you, but if you are a heavier rider, you'll eat through that sag pretty fast. So for me, it's pretty comfortable on just a normal road, no bumps or anything. It definitely feels smooth, but then when you hit a bump, it tends to bite pretty fast, if that makes any sense. For normal everyday riding and commuting, I think the suspension is more than adequate. However, if you're the type that really likes to get after it in the corners, that rear end may feel a little vague. So, depending on what you weigh, it may or may not be a problem. So let's talk about lighting. This bike does have LED lighting all around. Thank God. The turn signals act as running lights when they're not being used, so that's kind of a nice feature for Honda. The main headlight is nice and bright at night, but it doesn't have a wide throw, it's more of like a forward throw. And then when you turn on the high beam, it adds another light down the middle. And you'll notice that that high beam is very directional, so it's just mainly the middle. It doesn't really illuminate much of anything on the sides. So the front lights are good and bright. They aren't as bright as I thought they would be. And at night, coupled with the turn signals running as running lights, it really lets oncoming traffic know how much of a footprint you're taking up. However, moving back to the tail section, the tail light is very bright, and traffic behind you should have no problem seeing your motorcycle. Moving down to the tires, the stock tires that come with this seem to be fine. I haven't had any grip or slippage issues with them, so in my opinion, they're fine. Moving on to the engine. So, to my surprise, this engine is lots of fun. It's surprisingly peppy. It's not a slouch off the line either. I really love riding this engine. I tend to keep it more on the boil than other bikes that I ride. It's just a whole lot of fun wringing out that single cylinder. The stock exhaust isn't a whole lot to write home about, but I was pleasantly surprised that it had a nice raspy tone as well as some pulsing bassy undertones. And here's the big question that everyone asks. Can it do the Interstate? And the answer is yes, yes it can. Honda claims this bike has a top speed of 100 miles an hour. For me, the top speed was 88 miles an hour on the Interstate. Now, I'm 6'1" and a little under 200 pounds, so with all my gear and a little bit of luggage, I'm a little over that. And still, my top speed with all my gear and everything was still 88 miles an hour. And this is about what I expected for this size of an engine. So I would say you could cruise at 70, 75 pretty much all day long and save that last little bit for when you need it. Now this is a light bike, and at high speeds like that, in the 70, 75, 80, 85 mile an hour range, I didn't feel any squirreliness from the bike. I didn't feel like the bike was uneasy. For those of you who have been following my channel, you'll know that I owned also the Rebel 300 as my first actual motorcycle. And it has the same engine in this, and I'm pretty sure it's tuned differently for both bikes. Now, the Rebel is a heavier motorcycle than this 300R, and I enjoy the engine in the 300R more than I did in the Rebel. There's nothing wrong with the 300 being in the Rebel, but in the 300R, it just seemed to work that much better. It's probably also because the bike is only 328 pounds or somewhere around there, so I'm sure that has a lot to do with it. Moving on to fuel consumption, miles per gallon. So when I first got this bike, I was averaging about 70 miles per gallon. And after about 1,000 miles, almost at every fuel up, like 5 fuel ups in a row, I was getting between 73 and 74. I believe Honda claims it gets 76. Now, I was getting 73 to 74, and I wasn't really babying the bike. I was doing a mix of in-town riding, stop-and-go traffic, and interstate. Getting over 70 miles per gallon consistently for me was a big deal, and I think if you're using this thing as a commuter or going to work, it's definitely light on your pocket. Most other bikes that I've owned usually get between 40 and 55 miles per gallon, so getting that extra boost is really nice, especially if you're stepping down to a lower displacement bike. That extra MPGs is definitely a great icing on the cake. Let's talk about a few things I dislike about the bike. There aren't many, but I feel like they're worth mentioning. Of course, the obvious thing here is it may be a little cramped for taller riders. So depending on your ergos when you sit on the bike, you'll have to make that judgment call. I'm 6'1", and I was very comfortable on the bike. I was maybe just a little bit cramped, but nothing uncomfortable. The next thing is that the helmet locks on this bike are not good in my opinion. To hang your helmet on the bike, you have to pop the back seat off, and there are just 2 hooks where you can put your D-rings on, and then you have to put the seat back on. So it's a little fiddly, and so I just never used it because I don't want to be popping the seat off every time I want to hang my helmet. I'd rather just have a real helmet lock. The other thing to note is getting to the battery sucks. You have to pop off the seat, unscrew a few bolts, and then unscrew a few bolts in the front of the tank, and the tank tilts up. It's not overly complicated or complex, it's just a little fiddly and inconvenient. The other 2 things are the front screen does scratch easily and seems a little bit fragile to me, and the bike seems to run a little lean from the factory. In fact, I think most Hondas do, but this one particularly, sometimes when you start it, it dies right away and you have to start it again to get it moving. It's happened a handful of times in owning the bike, but it always starts up and stays started on the second start. About vibrations, there's nothing crazy about the vibrations on this bike. However, when you are getting after it, there are vibes there. It's nothing off-putting, to me anyway, but it's there. The last thing is the way the bike sits off the showroom floor. It doesn't really have any storage space at all for any bags. Now, under the passenger seat, there is a little bit of a cubby under there for your manual or an Allen wrench or a couple of tools, but nothing crazy. And the last thing is there aren't any real tie-down points for this. So you can see I had a bag in the picture that was tied down. However, I used the reflector mount to tie down my luggage. Something to note about this bike too is the front end of it. And what I mean by that is when you're sitting on the bike with your hands on the bars and going down the road, there really isn't much bike in front of you. And what I mean by that is if you're wearing a regular helmet like an RF 1200 or a Bell Qualifier or something like that, like you don't really see the controls or anything below you. In my opinion, it really puts you into the ride and focused on the road. So depending on who you are, this could be a pro or a con. For me, at the beginning, it was a little bit weird, but not off-putting, just weird. And in the end, it was something I really loved about riding this bike. So who do I think this bike is for? Obviously, it's designed with the beginner rider in mind. And in my opinion, maybe someone who has a bigger CC bike or a cruiser who's looking for something different, a rip around town, economical, and fun motorcycle. I really had plans to keep this bike for a very long time and to actually modify it to be a mild off-roader. But as my riding journey continues and I progress as a rider, I find myself really drawn to motorcycle camping and taking the road less traveled. With just a couple days of owning this bike, I said, you know, this might make a really great dirt bike. And that was actually my plan, to turn this into maybe a 70 road, 30% off-road bike. But then I saw the ad for this bike, the Honda CB300R. So as the story goes, I ended up selling the bike to free up some funds for the new purchase. Because of COVID-19, there have been massive delays in new stock coming into dealerships. I do have one on order, but there's no telling of when it'll get here. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I really hope you enjoyed this video and my take on the Honda CB300R. When I bought this bike, I had no intentions of going off-road or doing anything like that. But since my riding is moving in that direction, I'm really looking for something 50-50. With that said though, if you're primarily a road rider looking for something inexpensive with unique styling, it's really gonna be hard to beat the Honda CB300R. Thanks for watching, everybody. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.